Are atheists or are religious people better people? Let's solve this once and for all because the data is complex. So first, let's look at public perception. We know that the perception is that atheists are less moral, less trustworthy, and the more a country is religious, the more that that's true. And Pew Research in 2019 found that in the US, many people still believe that morality is impossible without belief in God, and even non-religious participants will stereotype atheists as more likely to commit immoral acts. This is also why we can't trust any of the statistics about atheists in jail. In fact, we're going to have to throw out that data altogether because I would love to say as an atheist that there are very few atheists in prison. I would love for that to be a point for atheism, but we know that religious people get better treatment, better food, opportunities to visit religious classes, and you're more likely to get parole if you claim to have found God in prison or you were religiously active in prison. And so it's too biased to trust that data because people will say that they're religious because they know that they will be perceived better if they do. And so when you add to that the conditioning that Americans got, that the tragedies of the 20th century were from atheists like Stalin, even though Stalin ran his regime like a religion, like this was a political religion, not secularism. This was not humanism. This was not free speech. This was a political religion. But all of that helps especially Americans conclude that atheism is immoral and that they are bad people. But I digress. Let's dig into the data. One argument is that religious people give more. Now, religious people tend to give more money to religious charities and they volunteer more within their communities. Atheists and non-religious people give more to secular charities, disaster relief, and humanitarian causes. So atheists are more likely to give outside their in-group than religious people. So when experiments control for in-group bias, religious and non-religious people are about equally generous. There's not a huge difference. So when you look at large-scale studies on self-reporting, religious people will outscore atheists on volunteering, charitable giving, blood drives, and community involvement. But the majority of that is coming from pressure within the community, and the giving is also going to that community that you benefit from. So an easy example that's just my own life is as a Mormon, I gave 10% of my income to the Mormon church, which outstrips most atheists when it comes to giving. I was also spending about 10 hours a week in church related kind of service. And so again, that's going to outstrip atheists when it comes to volunteering and giving up my income. But the majority of that came from pressure that if I don't do that, I can't go to the temple. And if I can't go to the temple, I can't be with my family forever. And I'm going to get called into my bishop's office. And I'm going to be asked why I'm not paying tithing. And I'm going to live in fear that God's not going to bless me. So yes, I did give 10%, but we know that in the Mormon church, less than 1% of their billions of dollars goes to humanitarian charitable aid. Most of it goes to churches and temples and paying seminary teachers and all the upkeep required for the church. So now that I'm an atheist, I don't give 10% of my income away. But when I do give money, it's often outside my own tribe. So my family here, we give a lot of money and resources to the Women and Children's Alliance here in Nampa, Idaho, where I live. And we do family activities where we shop for the needs of that center. And I give aid that is more likely to actually go to some kind of humanitarian crisis that I'm not directly benefiting from. So the data on that is that yes, religious people are more giving and more service oriented, but it's directed, like the pressure from that is coming from their community and the money and service is going to their community. But atheists will give more to people outside their in-group, but less overall. Now let's look at compassion and empathy. And this is where atheists and non-religious people will outshine religious people, even in children. So experiments in 2015 found that children from atheist or secular households shared more, punished less harshly, and were less judgmental than children from religious households. Children from religious households were more judgy, but that judgmentalness didn't lead to more prosocial behavior. So when it comes to compassion, atheists have less judgment, more sharing, less retribution than the religious, even in children. And this was 1,200 children studied across 6 countries. And so the religious children were more punitive and less altruistic than non-religious children, even though the parents rated their children as more moral. And so we have also this concept of subconscious cueing that we have to look at. And this is one set of data where the religious people tend to do better. So religious people are continually reminded of their higher self or higher values. So when we do like morality tests where it's very easy to cheat, but we have religious people like walk past a church on the way to the experiment, or there was a religious quote or an image in the room, they will cheat less and they will act more morally because they've been reminded consciously or subconsciously about their values. And atheists and secular people don't have reminders as often. And it is one of the failures of secularism that they haven't been able to create like holidays and quotes and things in the community that reminds us of our secular values. But we found that if secular people are reminded of their secular values, like we did some follow-up studies, like there's posters in the room of secular heroes and quotes from them about free speech and humanism and whatnot, they also get that morality boost compared to when they're just doing the experiment in an empty room. And so when people are primed, like if you're a believer and you're primed with religious concepts like God or divine, they're going to behave more generously in economic games when we are doing these studies. And also when we prime secular people with things like jury or rule of law, it produced the same effect. And so this shows that it's not really about God or religion per se, but that religion can help with those cues of accountability. And if religious people are getting that more, then they're getting more subconscious cueing towards moral behavior than secular people. But when secular people do get it, they do just as well. So if we were to summarize what we know overall about morality between atheists and people from organized religions, is that religious people show more pro-social behavior, but only within their in-group. And that's for reasons of continual reminders and cueing, social pressure from within the community, more community involvement in general, and fear of what would happen if they were immoral. What we tend to see from atheists is more compassion, more empathy, and more giving to people who are even outside their own in-group, but less pro-social behavior in their in-group because they're not as well organized. They're not showing up for, like when I was a Mormon, it was like probably once a month we were doing some kind of like raking leaves for, old people or whatever we were doing. And because the secular world is not as organized, we're going to see less of that internal pro-social behavior where there's gathering for like service opportunities and things like that. And so we see from these studies that religion doesn't directly make people more moral. It makes them more cooperative within their in-group. And so religious people do volunteer more and give more, but it's through their congregational networks. And they found that the social connections of church going, not belief itself, predicted generosity. And so it makes sense actually to not trust atheists evolutionarily. And so we have to like take a step back and look at this. When we were in tribes of 150 people, you didn't need to invent gods that were moral overseers because you pay an instant cost to socially bad behavior. If you're a thief, now the tribe knows that you're a thief. You don't need any eternal punishment because you pay an instant cost for that. But if you live in a big city, how can you trust people when you don't know everyone? And the one way that we solved that was believing in the same God. That if we believe in the same God, and I know that this God is going to punish you if you cheat me, then it's like a social lubricant for building trust, especially in a world, we have to remember, like a world without a justice system. And so if you get your morality from God and then you meet an atheist, the distrust, it's like a tribal sense of distrust, comes from what keeps you from cheating me? How can I trust you? Because what they see in an atheist is, oh, you don't have any moral guidelines because I built that on God, but you don't have that. So you don't have any moral guidelines that can keep you from cheating me. Therefore, I can't trust you. So there's this kind of like evolutionary base for this distrust, even though the statistics show that atheists are more likely to be kind to anyone either in or outside their, their direct group. And so it's almost as if we need some way to signal that in modern society. Like we need atheists to be able to say, I'm running for office or I'm trying to get parole, but I am a Stoic. I get my character, guidelines from the virtues of Stoicism, or I get my moral values from secularism and civic duty. I take my civic duty very seriously. That way, when people meet you, because if you just say atheist, which means I don't have a God, and they've built their morality on God, what they're hearing from you is you don't have any morality. And so it's like what we need in modern society is some way to signal, I do have a sense of morality. Here's where it comes from, so that people will be able to trust atheists. But right now, especially in America, you could not run for office and be an atheist because we just have no sense of where your morality comes from. So what we do know are the best. So if it's not God directly, what are the best predictors for good behavior? Like what actually creates good behavior in humans? And we have four attributes that seem to be true across the board. And the four are empathy, security, education, and freedom from fear. So first, empathy. This is just our capacity to feel with others. And we have, mirror neurons and brain regions that will light up when we see others in pain. So whether you're religious or atheist, if you are high in empathy, just in how your brain reacts to like watching someone cry, it's going to predict altruism and forgiveness and moral action. Religion can cultivate that through like rituals and stories and compassion teachings, but so can secular practices like meditation or therapy or moral education. So both can increase your capacity for altruism, but you also are naturally more or less altruistic with just your brain. So that's one predictor of, are you going to be a good person? Second is security and stability. So we have the existential security theory from 2004 that shows that when people feel safe economically, physically, politically, they're more likely to be tolerant. They're going to be less violent. They're going to be more altruistic. Even religions will be less violent when they feel safe. So like when Islam felt like it wasn't being attacked in any way and things were going really good economically, politically, physically for them, we get a golden age of Islam. And when they feel threatened, they can go right back to fundamentalism at any time. And this is why secular Northern Europe is going to score so high on prosocial behavior without religion. It's because people feel safe. People have social safety nets, and that is going to lead to more altruistic behavior. The third one is education, and education increases cognitive empathy. It reduces prejudice. It helps people see morality as universal, and higher education is going to correlate with more charitable giving, less authoritarianism, less violence. Religious or secular, educated individuals are better at being able to just see people and take perspectives rather than jumping into antisocial behavior. In fact, secular countries, I was for a different TikTok, I was digging into how many countries put limits on homeschooling, like France and the Nordic countries, that they essentially are saying like, it is so important to educate these children and it affects all of us, that you have to show that like you're a teacher who is capable of teaching before we just like let you homeschool your children because it affects all of us. Whereas in America, we're much, less strict when it comes to homeschooling children. And the next one is freedom from fear. So looking at your stress and your cortisol levels. So Sapolsky, the stress research that he's done shows that chronic fear, living in high cortisol, makes us more aggressive, less rational, more prone to scapegoating. Anytime we get authoritarianism, it's because there is chronic fear and people need a savior. And so we look to someone to save us. And so people who are under stress will cling to rigid rules and harsh punishments, whether it's religious or secular, right? Like you can get Hitler, who's able to use religion. You can get Stalin, who's able to create a political religion, but you're going to cling to the same kind of rigid rules and harsh punishments to try and reduce fear. But when you have social safety nets, when you have fairness in your justice system, and you have like social trust, you're able to act with more kindness and more fairness. So we know from studies that when people feel a loss of control, they're more likely to go towards conspiracy theories or an interventionist God or just anywhere where they can feel safe. So fear and uncertainty will push people towards more rigid, more punitive, really more unethical moral frameworks. And so being a better person is really not about whether or not someone believes in God. The most we can get from that is you get more pro-social behavior within your in-group if you have a religious community. That's the most that we could say. But when we talk about being a good person, it's about the social and biological conditions that bring out either the best in human nature or the worst in human nature. And so it depends on how did you have a capacity for empathy, right? Like, so did you have trauma or psychopathy that reduce that? That would be something that would reduce your capacity for good behavior. How's your security? Do you feel secure? Are you educated? And are you living free from fear? And if you have those things, you're going to be a good person. You're going to act in pro-social ways. And if you have the opposite of those, like if you're in a situation where you're low in empathy, you're low in security, you're low in education, and you're living in fear, you're going to get the worst parts of human nature, not just individually, but collectively. So a fearful, poor, uneducated society will show more cruelty and corruption. A secure, educated, empathetic society will show more fairness and compassion. So it's too easy to say that violent countries are religious, and if you just drop your religion, then you'll just become Denmark, right? I hear this argument from atheists, and I just think it's a naive argument. What has to happen first is economic stability. And with economic stability comes safety and security. And with that, people have the opportunity for education. And with that, we have the opportunity to build a justice system and build social trust. And then they don't feel threatened. And then they can become more tolerant and more pro-social and more empathetic without it feeling unsafe. And then and only then could they outgrow gods and outgrow religions and just kind of use that as a culture and still act with kindness and compassion. So secular societies consistently score higher on measures of tolerance and gender equality and low corruption and humanitarian values. And, you know, when we look at Denmark and Sweden, they show high levels of social trust, low crime, high well-being without religiosity. But it's not just the fact that they dropped religion. It's because they had the stability to get there. And so it's too easy to say that like religious people are more moral. Like most of that is just in-group behavior. But it's also too easy to say that if religious or if violent religious countries would just drop religion, that they would just magically become more moral because they're atheists. I don't think that that's true either. So what happens is instability breeds religion, and then clinging on to this like eternal sense of justice when justice is corrupt in this life. And then that religion will then perpetuate violence and poverty and religious warfare. So the religion doesn't cause the violence. The violence and instability is there first. People latch on to the religion just as something to hold on to. And then the religion perpetuates the problem further because we're not dealing with problems on the ground. We've pushed things off into the next life just so we can have a little hope. So while we can say that atheists are more likely to show compassion and secular countries are doing better than religious countries, we have to admit privilege. And when I say privilege, I don't mean it like in this cancel culture kind of way. I mean it like it's a privilege that I hope everyone has someday. Like I hope that someday we have enough in the world, we have enough social safety nets and security and a solid justice system and education for everyone and low cortisol levels and resources for everyone that we could be kind to other humans without feeling threatened and without having to be ruled by one religion. Like that's what I hope for everyone. So Scandinavia didn't become peaceful because they dropped religion. They built stability, safety, and fairness first. And then once people no longer needed religion for social trust or survival, then belief naturally declined on its own. So the reason right now for why America can't be, let's just be kind to one another. Like there are cities in Finland that have no like people who are doing a checkout. Like there's no humans doing that. People just come into the store and they just like scan their items and then walk out, and there's no stealing and there's no crime, and people just always return their grocery carts. And why can't we have that in America? And it's because we have too much instability and inequality and a rising middle class in survival mode. And we can't fix that, and we can't create the social safety nets and reinvest in education and healthcare and all those things because the religious right is cutting those programs. And so what we see then in religious countries is instability, problems creates fear. Fear creates religiosity. The religion then perpetuates the instability by getting all theocratic, and then they prevent the measures being put into place that would actually raise the bottom and chill everybody the F out, which then leads us to the very tricky ethical question of how bad does the religious right have to make things so that there's enough of a reaction to be able to put guardrails in place and social safety nets in place that we see from other first world countries? I don't know the answer to that. I mean, just this week, Donald Trump said, a lot of people are saying they want a dictator, and it's like, not all of us. But it almost feels like in America we're so religious, and now our political ideology is like a religious war, that it does feel like it's going to have to get worse before it gets better. And so the hope is that the dumpster fire that is now our current political system hopefully creates a backlash that has enough oomph behind it that it will be able to create a social safety net and fix institutional issues that are making people so fearful and their stress so high. And then once that happens, like, the religious fervor will calm down and everybody could just be kind to each other just because we're human. But we literally can't get there until people feel safe. And when we have this much, people who can't feel like they can afford their groceries, they're not going to feel safe enough to be able to just be kind without religion. Like, that fear will drive them to some kind of religious ideology or some totalitarian leader who promises that it's going to be okay, even though it makes it worse. So once and for all, religious people more pro-social within their in-group, atheists more kind to people overall. And how we get there, or what makes you a good person or a bad person, mostly has to do with the brain that you're born with, how much education you have, and how safe you feel. And if we can get that for everyone, maybe we could live in a world where we could just be kind. All right, that's it for me. See you next week here at No Nonsense Spirituality.